and gentlemen, this is League for Republic Democracy of Australia, Republic of Australia, and long live Republic of Australia. We are League for Republic Democracy of Australia, long live Republic of Australia, LFDRA.org. We do not support Liberal, Labor, National Parties or the Greens, and are not associated with Liberal, Labor or the Greens, human rights abusers and trust misuse and abuse and slavery, entrapment, murderous chemical warfare rampage by Scott, Bill and Tanya Plibersbeck and their staffers. Long live an LFDRA government in Australia. And yet again, Scott Morrison announced $1 billion plus for a murderous, torturous, mind control, chemical weaponry, gulags, weaponry warfare in Australia, a life of a murderous, Fed-funded, state-extorted chemical warfare rampage as seen by Stalin Russia's ideologue paper, circulation and slavery entrapment. We do not support Liberal, I'll say it again, we do not support Liberal, Labor, National Parties or the Greens, and are not associated with Liberal, Labor or the Greens, human rights abusers and trust misuse and abuse and slavery, entrapment, murderous chemical warfare rampage by Scott, Bill, Tanya Plibersbeck and their staffers. Long live an LFDRA government in Australia. And yet again, Scott Morrison announced $1 billion plus for a murderous, torturous, mind control, chemical weaponry, gulags, weaponry warfare in Australia, life of a murderous, Fed-funded, state-extorted, chemical warfare rampage as seen by Stalin Russia, ideologue paper, circulation and slavery entrapment. Please do vote and nominate your LFDRA candidates in the upcoming election in 2019. We are League for Republic Democracy of Australia. LFDRA.org. League for Republic Democracy of Australia, LFDRA. Under an LFDRA government, all Australians receive complimentary 3-bedroom homes and ownership title documents with solar power generation allowance, household solar power generation allowance, ending slavery entrapment for all Australians. We are LFDRA.org, League for Republic Democracy of Australia. Because of the slavery entrapment in Australia and the extortions on insurances and bank extortions, and when their businesses run a loss, they extort more money with bank fees and insurance extortions. Age pension in Australia under an LFDRA government will be at age 55, including tax-free superannuation release, including an extra 2 times $100 notes for all payments in Australia. We see the political tactics of the Liberal Party at the moment, and their political tactics are appalling in modern standards of the planet. Plus 17 million under an LFDRA government, plus 17 million complimentary 3-bedroom homes for Australians with ownership title documents, and the 8 kilowatt solar power household generation allowance for all Australian citizens under an LFDRA government in Australia. Also ending slavery entrapment with a wage minimum in Australia set at $79,000 per year with 4 weeks paid holiday and 12 personal days a year, ending the slavery entrapment and murderous rampage and $50,000 fines for employers that abuse and use slavery entrapped Australians to produce products. So 12 personal days a year in federal legislator, first sitting day, and Fair Work Commission follow-up compliance, and $50,000 fines per minute any employee in Australia is underpaid Australian minimum, and creation of ABNS numbers for self-managed superannuation investments or accrual, including traineeships and apprenticeships in Australia, and superannuation rates as a federal minimum of 15% on top of the $79,000 per year with an 8.5% tax rate for all Australians as a federal minimum, and the $50,000 fines per minute any employee in Australia is underpaid by the Coliseum businesses. And we'll say it again, in other economic terms, $333,000 per complementary three-bedroom homes with ownership title documents and a tax rate of 8.5% for Australians, including 3,300 $100 notes print per complementary three-bedroom homes with ownership title documents, and it cannot go into any current or existing banks. And solar power 8 kilowatt household generation allowance, and raising the federal minimum Australia-wide for all Australian citizens. Under an LFDRA government in Australia, also, like I'll say it again, also ending the slavery entrapment in the supply chain in Australia, with a wage minimum in Australia set at $79,000 per year for a 38-hour week, with 4 weeks paid holiday and 12 personal days a year, and federal legislator first sitting day and Fair Work Commission follow-up compliance, and $50,000 fines per minute any employee in Australia is underpaid Australian minimum, and creation of the ABNS numbers to stop the insurance extortion and excruciating fees, extortions coming out of superannuation funds. And then we see the current governments, both Liberal, Labor and the National parties, leave Australians with absolutely nothing after being exploited in slavery entrapment to make Coliseum businesses billions and billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars, to be left with nothing. Traineeships and apprenticeships in Australia, and superannuation rates as a federal minimum of 15% on top of the $79,000 per year with an 8.5% tax rate, and $50,000 fines per minute any employee is underpaid the federal minimum, underpaid a federal minimum in Australia, or even 50 years jail time for employers that put shit on their employees to avoid for airline profits. We'll phase out state sectional driver's licences with Australia-wide driver's licensing centres. Victimisation has occurred for too many productive Australians commuting safely to and from work within Australia, and including international law licences that drive on the same side of the road as Australians and other Australia-wide road users. We saw under the Scott Morrison, Malcolm Turnbull government, what did we see there? We saw a negligent government to the Constitution, that engineered departments within their federal government for revenues that was negligent to the Constitution of the day. With a new Australia-wide driver's licensing centres, Australia-wide governed by a MyGov service delivery platform, with the new Australia-wide licensing centres, ending the vicious victimisation of productive Australians commuting safely to and from work, as well as phasing out oil, refined and ethanol fuels by 2020 for Australians. You can also check that out at lfdra.org/registration, horizontal line, Australia. Chemical warfare in Australia. Yet again, Scott Morrison announced $1 billion plus for a murderous, torturous chemical warfare rampage, and Bill and Tanya Pliberspeck all support a murderous, torturous chemical warfare rampage as seen in Russia by Stalin's ideologue paper. The Queen wants institutional slavery, entrapment and a murderous chemical warfare campaign on the populace of Australia, doing the wrong thing by the people of Australia and destroying life expectancy. We also saw the sugar mill in South Africa. You can see why they were kicked out of South Africa. A murderous campaign by Liberal, Labor and National chemical mind control weaponised gulags in Australia, and many murders and destruction of life expectancy in Australia by their chemical warfare on the populace of Australia. We know chemical warfare gulags in Australia, facilitators in mind control chemical warfare gulags in Australia, were green lighted by banks. Most of the medical profession in Australia were green lighted by banks for property house investment exploits that made 80% of the population homeless renters. And if it wasn't bad enough that life expectancy decreased in the population of Australia by mind control chemical warfare gulags, that what it does is it causes a stroke, then destruction in cardiovascular health, and a neuroleptic malignant syndrome, which causes death from being dusted in a paddock with a concrete additive. Long live Republic of Australia. Purity Labor Party mind control weapon gulag staffers and advisors that were non-integral members of the Australian community fortified non-integral mind control chemical weapon gulags in Queensland in their current term of office in Queensland, breaching freedoms Australians deserve. And in Hobart, we saw the Liberal Party increase mind control chemical and other mind control weaponised gulags in Tasmania, breaching the freedoms Australians deserve. And like I said, Scott Morrison, Tanya Plibersbeck, Bill Shorten all support $1 billion plus in a murderous, torturous chemical warfare rampage on the populace of Australia that we saw by Stalin Russia in an ideologue paper. Like I'll say it again, Scott Morrison, Bill Shorten, Tony Abbott, John Howard and Malcolm Turnbull all support a murderous chemical warfare rampage on the populace of Australia through their chemical warfare gulags, facilitated by a murderous rampage by state governments, palletised plastic extortions, and under a Mark Butler's past ministry and a Stalin Russia ideologue paper on the populace of Australia, in which the Fed facilitates the murderous chemical warfare campaign facilitated by state extortionists. And what did Julia Gillard say earlier on Sky News earlier today? What did she say? And what was all the focus on? They said, do not focus on the statistics. Do not focus on the statistics defeating the former Labor government. They said, don't focus on the statistics because they wanted to keep the airline profits pumping. So then we saw the National Party come out. We saw the National Party come out and said, look, just let all foreigners just fly in on airlines, and then so they got the profits coming up in the airline industry, and Julia Gillard saying, oh yeah, the statistics. And what did the statistics tell us about airline profits? I know ASIO doesn't want to hear a thing about airline profits because the negligent government to the Constitution engineered all of their departments to revenue for airline profits. And Tanya Plibersbeck, Mark Butler and the Queen's institutional chemical rampage and Scott Morrison's $1 billion spend on mind control chemical warfare gulags on the populace of Australia. I told you before, it causes stroke, then it causes destruction in cardiovascular health, and then it causes syndromes such as neuroleptic malignant syndrome. And in the meantime, some psychopathic neurologist may cut a piece of your brain out and try to think that you're somebody else, so the pharmacist can extort extortion from the Fed through the states. We know state law is non-compliant with federal law. We know that the Liberal Party, Labor Party and National Party and members in staffers invested in bankhouse investment exploits that ended home ownership title documents for 80% of the population, and the current Fair Work Commission resignation on doing what's right for the people of Australia. So employees in businesses in the Coliseum businesses today will make them billions and billions and billions and billions and billions and billions, multiple hundreds of billions of dollars in a tenure at an employee place. And then the government will leave them with absolutely nothing, and the employer will leave them with absolutely nothing because the insurance extortions and the excruciating fees on superannuation extortions just come out straight away, and they extort the populace left, right and centre. We know the former and current Liberal Party governments, like I said earlier, are negligent to the Constitution, and Liberal, Labor and National parties, including Bob Brown and the Greens, are negligent in doing what's right for the people of Australia. We saw the thing with the McDonald family. We saw their only interest at the time was Morgan, Scone and Inverell and their beef processing plant that lost power, and the council of the Sapphire City invested in it to keep it open, and all the profits went to them. There's a dirty, dirty game on water for agriculture and airline profits in Australia, and that's the reality of the world we live in Coliseum businesses. And yet again, Scott Morrison commits $1 billion plus for a murderous chemical warfare rage on the populace of Australia. You can watch our free live events videos and the link on our Candidates League for Republic Democracy of Australia, found at lfdra.org. Live events videos on the link below, with our live events videos found on the Facebook social media platform, or use the link below for the direct link to lfdra.org/video link. To find out more about LFDRA League for Republic Democracy of Australia, scroll through all of our pages and stay up to date with us on social media platform Facebook and bookmark lfdra.org. The Australian Parliament and staffers of the Liberal Party and the Labor Party and the National Party and the Greens created slavery entrapment in aged care in Australia and their staffers through a federal government-based training package for below poverty line slavery entrapped Australians. To basically work as poverty entrapped slaves in aged care for nothing, and then end up with flat rate slavery entrapment rate of pay under the current Australian Parliament. Destroyed quality in the Australian Parliament for slavery entrapment and reduction in quality for shareholders and investors in poverty aged care sector in Australia. To add, my grandfather was an Australian trainer. He had his legs cut off and he was being tortured every day by aged care, and he could not even move his legs. He was being tortured by foreigners in this country every single day up until the day he died, and they could not. I remember as a child, I sat on the floor and I looked for his legs and I could not see his legs, and he was being tortured every single day. Scott, and I'll say it again, Scott Morrison, Tanya Plibersbeck, Bill Shorten all support a murderous, $1 billion plus, torturous, mind control, chemical weapon gulags in Australia, as we've seen by Stalin Russia. Now, just on the Tully Caravan Park and all the conclaves around the country for airline profits, all the conclaves around the country for airline profits, Coliseum businesses and slavery entrapment in Australia. Ending mind control weaponised gulags in Australia. I said this before, after prolonged forced chemical warfare gulag torture comes stroke and destruction of cardiovascular health, and syndromes such as neuroleptic malignant syndrome causes death. Exactly what happened to the United States citizen, American citizen, that went to North Korea and was tortured in a gulag in North Korea. And this is what was happening within Australia. Police auxiliaries were obviously in a protection racket for a protection racket, and were raping their chemical warfare tortured victims for pregnancy category testings for pharmaceutical extortions in Australia, for state extortions. And it wouldn't surprise me if the state government were murdering people for Medicare extortion of the Fed. Scott Morrison announced $1 billion plus for a chemical weaponry warfare in Australia. Federal Liberal National Party coalitions and Labor parties. The Liberal National Party, McDonald, under former Prime Minister, under Howard, obviously Malcolm Turnbull was kicked out of the federal parliament and fled the country. Liberal National Party, McDonald, under former Prime Minister, refused construction that would have protected Brisbane and the people of Toowoomba from flood. Peter Beattie, who was a representative of the state section within Australia, forecast a dam needed to be built in that area to avoid a flood event. Now, the National Liberal Party under McDonald refused the construction of a dam that would have protected Brisbane from flood event. And then we saw the thing with the Filipino Special Forces bullshit, but I'm not getting into it. McDonald opposed it, all the surveillancing, and they used chemical warfare at the school because McDonald was obviously he was in the federal government, and they had a lot of political persuasion in federal politics at the time. And they owned Mergen, Scone and Inverell, and were becoming Coliseum businesses. Bill Shorten, Tony Abbott, John Howard and Malcolm Turnbull, like I said, Tanya Plibersbeck, Scott Morrison, all support a murderous chemical warfare rampage on the populace of Australia through the chemical warfare gulags. Now, McDonald opposed it, and at the time, the surveillancing went into the Toowoomba bypass, and the Liberal National Party, McDonald, commercial interest in Mergen, Scone, and Inverell at that time opposed the construction of the dam in the Lockyer Valley, which was Murphy's Creek. There was a bark hut. There was a bark hut and an old steam train locomotive water tank, and it was always known in a particular name of that area. Now, there was an artesian basin. There's an artesian basin there, and through the construction of a dam wall, it would have, the years and years and years ago, the township of Murphy's Creek was a raging city in town, and it moved to the top of the range and it became Toowoomba. Murphy's Creek was a raging community at that time, and that Murphy's Creek would have refilled the artesian basin with the creation of the dam wall. It went into the Atkinson Dam. The Atkinson Dam overflow went in, and pipes went through the road at the Atkinson Dam, and the dam wall would have been built, which would have protected Brisbane from flood event if the dam wall would have been built. But because of the business warfare over water and agriculture and getting $100 million buildings up, it wasn't, they had no respect for human life. So I'll say it again, for thousands of years, Toowoomba was known, the township of Murphy's Creek was known as Big Swamp in the Indigenous term. There was one bark hut remaining after the township moved. How the old township bounced back centuries ago, like I said earlier in this, was McDonald opposed it for Mergen, and all the agricultural profits are only thinking $1 million businesses up, seeing businesses. And that's why the Constitution of Australia says government income can't be referred to as revenue, and there's Revenue Minister, which is obviously negligent to the Constitution that engineered all departments to revenue. So under an LFDRA government, age pensions and other pensions after, so we'll end slavery and entrapment in Australia, and like on the when employees within Australia make businesses billions and billions and billions of dollars in Coliseum businesses, and they've worked their whole lives in Australia. And under the Julia Gillard government, they said, "No, sorry, Australians must remain in Australia and continue on in slavery and entrapment until they're 70." And they're not able to visit they're not able to travel outside of Australia and visit other countries because of the slavery and entrapment and all the extortions through superannuations, and then governments, Coliseum businesses leaving employees in Australia with nothing, and then they're unable to travel outside of Australia and visit other countries and receive a pension because their superannuation has been extorted from being homeless renters all their lives. And 80% of the population are homeless renters. And then we saw the solar power. Then we saw 80% of the population are homeless renters. And then we saw the solar power grants under the Julia Gillard government, and the solar power under the Liberal, Labor, National Party and the Greens, all extorted by property investors and put into commercial farms, and made Australians pay for electricity yet again, when under an LFDRA government there'll be an 8 kilowatt solar power household allowance, and all that money will not be allowed to go into existing banking infrastructure because they've just extorted the populace, and 80% of the population are homeless renters, and there's big business wars over water, and the dam wall should have been built, and McDonald was only interested in Mergen, Scone and Inverell that lost power, and then the council invested in it, and they're profiting from the embezzled money that went into the Mergen, Scone, Inverell over the water, and the damn wall should have been built. But I'm not getting into the Filipino Special Forces thing and the deaf sign language in the Filipino Special Forces stuff. So age pensions. So, you know, you used to be able to travel the countries for 3 to 6 months on pensions within Australia, and now you can only visit for a month. And Australians that have maybe been let go and are in slavery entrapment that want to visit other countries, when they leave Australia, are left with nothing. Now, Jackie Lambie, the hierarchical order brought Jackie Lambie down for saying doing what's right, but she's also a negative Australian on allowing people to visit other countries after being poverty and trapped slaves within Australia. So at the moment, when you leave Australia, any allowance will end. And the ideology of the day within Australia currently is, if you're not a slave for a billion, making businesses billions and billions and millions in a Coliseum business and left with nothing, most Australians are left with nothing. People are 60 before they even have a house in Australia, and they've been homeless renters all their lives because, you know, we saw Telcom that went Telstra, that then went private shares. We saw the Loan Act in 1972. We saw what happened in 1970 to 1975. So the Australian Parliament staff has created slavery entrapment and aged care through the training package. We see, like I said earlier, we see tobacco and alcohol impulse marketing us at airports around the planet. We see many airlines spam emails from communications businesses such as Telcom that went Telstra, then went private shares with an extra $40 billion spend. That we all we're going to see with the Liberal, Labor and the National parties is private business extortion on the embezzlement of the $40 billion. Under an LFDRA government, it will be open to all Australians. Yet again, Australians are left with poverty, slavery, entrapment rates of pay under Coliseum businesses within Australia. The current Liberal Party, ALP and National Party and others, and the way they all vote, in no way, shape or form is doing what's right for the people of Australia. This is true. Whenever the ALP is up in paid opinion marketing polls, they get hypocritical and always backflip on doing what's right. And the Liberal, Labor and National parties, including the Greens, have never done what's right for the people of Australia and their staffers. And like I said earlier, Scott Morrison announced $1 billion plus for a murderous chemical warfare rampage. Well, long live a planet free from slavery, entrapment, and Scott Morrison, Tanya Pliberspeck's, Bill Shorten's murderous chemical warfare rampage on Australians, free from Liberal, Labor and National parties, protection racket for a protection racket in Australia, and negligent governments to the Constitution that always misuse and abuse the trust of the people. I am Chief President J. Siller of the LFDRA League for Republic of Australia. Please do nominate and vote for your LFDRA candidates in Australia, and long live Republic of Australia. And we've seen the war in Australia over water. We've seen the war in Australia over McDonald, Merg and Scone, water in agriculture. We've seen the war over water in agriculture for airline profits and export production in Australia. We are League for Republic Democracy of Australia. Nominate and vote your LFDRA League for Republic Democracy of Australia candidates, and we will deliver for the people of Australia, ending mind control, weaponised forced abduction, chemical weaponry gulags in Australia. And like I said earlier, after prolonged forced abduction and chemical weaponry torture, chemical warfare, gulag torture, comes stroke and destruction of cardiovascular health and syndromes such as neuroleptic malignant syndromes, which causes death. Many people in Australia have been murdered by police auxiliaries and forced abduction chemical weaponry warfare on the populace. And it doesn't surprise me that the Queensland government murders people for federal extortion, and police auxiliaries were abducting and raping their chemical warfare tortured victims for pregnancy category testings and extortions. The pharmaceutical industry's extortions on the populace. Neurologists get all scalpel happy and cut people's brains out to extort, for pharmaceutical companies to extort uh, pharmaceutical profits from Fed extortion for state extortion and private business extortion in pharmaceuticals in these weaponry gulags and whatnot. So, like I said, they got what they wanted. Scott Morrison announced $1 billion plus for pieces of brain being cut out and pharmaceutical extortions and all of this on the populace of Australia for palletised extortions for Coliseum businesses. The start, well, that's about Long live LFDRA, League for Republic Democracy of Australia, and long live an LFDRA government, Republic of Australia. We do not support, I'll say it again, we do not support Liberal, Labor, National parties or the Greens, Bob Brown and McDonald and what occurred there with the surveillancing going into a Toowoomba bypass that didn't acquisition the old township of Murphy's Creek and build the dam wall that would have refilled the artesian basin, and they would have had so much more water with the dam wall that would have protected the people. It would have protected the people of Brisbane from flood event. And what we saw a lot of artesian bores being bores being drilled to discover veins of minerals between the artesian basin and the surface. We saw the artesian bore, but we saw a lot of bore going in to the veins of minerals from the artesian basin to the surface. And there's many veins, they're just looking for veins of minerals from the artesian basin to the surface. And the artesian basins are also very minerally itself in the water that it is. So the dam wall would have refilled the artesian basin, and because there's a large underwater aquifer, and with that dam wall, that dam being built in Murphy's Creek with a dam wall that would have gone straight through and refilled the aquifer, the underwater artesian basin, from the surface of the ground to the artesian basin would have refilled the artesian basin with the construction of the dam wall. That Peter Beattie, when he was the Premier in Queensland, he forecast that event would occur under the big swamp that it was, and all the looking for the veins from the artesian basin, to the surface, all the veins from the artesian basin. So please do vote and nominate for your LFDRA candidates in the upcoming election in 2019. We are League for Republic Democracy of Australia, lfdra.org. Like I said, Bankhouse Investment exploits and multiple rental property investors exploits stole household solar generation, as 80% of the population of Australia are homeless renters. The war over pharmaceutical extortions, the war over neurologists wanting to cut people's brains out for pharmaceutical extortions and all of that. And we saw what occurred from 1970 to 1975 under the Malcolm Fraser government in Australia, and made extorted Australians yet again pay for solar power generation grants and additives in cement. Under an LFDRA government, all Australians receive 8 kilowatt household solar power generation allowance. I am Chief and President, LFDRA, Chief President Harry J. Stiller, and we're climbing each and every day. We know state law is non-compliant with federal law, but yet again, the Liberal, Labor and National Party and the Greens and the current government are negligent to the Constitution that engineered all departments for revenue. We know that the current state law within Australia is negligent to federal law, but we see what's happening with the Liberal, Labor, National Party and the Greens. So like I said, home ownership title documents for 80% of the population and Fair Work Commission resignation on doing what's right for the people of Australia from what occurred from 1970 and 1975 in Australia. We know the former and current Liberal Party governments are negligent to the Constitution, and Liberal, Labor and National parties, including Bob Brown and the Greens, are negligent in doing what's right for the people of Australia. There is no need to spend $1 billion to send all the coal to India to pollute our atmosphere. There are many alternative energy sources. We'll phase out oil refined fossil fuels. We'll phase out oil refined fuels and ethanol fuels by 2020 for motor driven vehicles within Australia. That concludes the live broadcast here at League for Republic Democracy, LFDRA, on the social media link. I am Chief President Harry J. Stiller of the LFDRA. And once again, thanks for listening. Scroll through the entire site and we will deliver under an LFDRA government in Australia. Nominate your LFDRA candidates, vote for your LFDRA candidates. League for Republic Democracy of Australia. To find our live video events can be found at lfdra.org/video link. And we saw the moment the Liberal Party got re-elected, all the other commercial TV broadcast channels, and how many times they just keep on changing shareholders between the broadcast licenses in Australia is absolutely appalling. And we saw the moment Phony Tony Abbott got elected. What happened there? What happened there when Phony Tony Abbott got elected? What did we see there? We saw the stripping of other broadcast licenses in Australia. Malcolm Turnbull tried to redeem himself with other broadcast licenses, grants and whatnot. Or Coliseum businesses that just want to extort the populace and leave Australians with nothing, basically. That concludes the broadcast, and please do vote and nominate your LFDRA candidates, and we will deliver on all of our commitments under an LFDRA government in Australia. And long live the Republic of Australia, and long live an LFDRA government in Australia.